The storm on Corval's edge had no name, only a number, and it had been tearing across the moon's surface for 6 hours before anyone noticed the convoy had gone quiet. Daniel Ward was not the kind of man who noticed things going quiet. He noticed things breaking, and that night, a coolant valve on the outpost's western wall had cracked under the pressure of the storm, and that was the only reason he was outside at all. He walked with his head down, tool bag slung over one shoulder, the wind screaming past his suit in a way that made his teeth hurt. The outpost's lights behind him faded into a grey smear. Ahead, something was burning. He almost turned back. That would have been the smart thing. Instead, he kept walking, because the burning light was moving, flickering the way fire does when it is fighting against wind, and something in him did not like the idea of a fire dying alone out there without anyone even looking at it. The wreck was small, not a warship, not even a proper cargo hauler. It was a convoy shuttle, the kind used to move sealed goods between stations too poor or too remote for anything bigger. Its hull was split open like a dropped egg, and most of it was already buried in drifting grey dust. Daniel found 2 bodies near the entrance, both Velkari, both long past anything he could do for them. He said nothing. He did not know their names. He simply stepped past them, because there was still smoke coming from somewhere deeper inside, and where there was smoke, sometimes there was still something alive. He found the crate at the back of the cargo hold, wedged between 2 collapsed shelves. It was marked with symbols he did not read, but he understood the color coding well enough after 3 years on this outpost. Red meant hazardous, yellow meant fragile. This one was both, and it was already cracked down the middle. Inside, nestled in torn insulation foam, were 3 eggs. They were about the size of his 2 fists together, a dull grey-green, with faint veins of orange light running beneath the shell like something breathing under thin skin. He crouched there for a long moment, not touching them, just looking, while the wind howled through the broken hull behind him. Protocol was simple. He knew it the way he knew how to breathe. Any unidentified biological cargo, especially anything sealed under hazard coding, was to be left untouched and reported immediately to council custody. Corval's Edge had rules about this because half the galaxy had learned, the hard way, that unknown eggs sometimes hatched into things nobody wanted hatching. Daniel looked at the eggs a while longer. One of them shifted, just slightly, a small tremor beneath the shell. He was not a scientist. He had no authority to make decisions about alien biology, dangerous or otherwise. He was a maintenance engineer who fixed valves and patched hulls and kept the recycling units from choking on their own filters. He told himself this while he pulled off his outer glove and laid 2 fingers against the crate and felt warmth. Actual warmth, faint but real, coming from something that was, by every reasonable measure, still alive out here in the freezing dark. He thought about the 2 bodies by the entrance. Nobody had come for them yet either. By the time anyone official made it out here through the storm, whatever warmth was left in that crate would be long gone. He should call it in. He almost did. His hand actually moved to the comm unit at his collar, and he stood there for nearly a full minute with his thumb hovering over the switch, arguing with himself in a language that had no words, just a low, stubborn feeling in his chest that refused to let him press the button. In the end, he did not call it in. He wrapped the crate in a spare thermal sheet from his repair kit, tucked it under one arm like it weighed nothing at all, and carried it back through the storm toward the outpost, telling himself the entire way that he would report it first thing in the morning, once it was safe, once it was warm, once he knew for certain there was even anything left alive to report. Nobody saw him come in through the maintenance airlock. That was not unusual. Nobody watched the western entrance much, since it was mostly used for equipment. He carried the crate straight to his quarters, a narrow room barely big enough for a bunk and a desk, and set it down on the floor beside the heating vent, the warmest spot he had. He sat on the edge of his bunk and looked at it for a long time. The wind was still screaming outside, muffled now behind 3 layers of hull plating, and somewhere far off, he could hear the low hum of the outpost's night cycle beginning, lights dimming in the corridors, the world settling into sleep around him. He thought about calling Dr. Mann. She was reasonable, more reasonable than most of the council staff, and she might know what to do with 3 unhatched eggs from a species he could not name. But it was the middle of the night, and he told himself again, just until morning, just until he knew they would survive being moved at all. He did not sleep. He sat there on the floor beside the crate with his back against the wall, one hand resting lightly on the thermal sheet, feeling for that faint warmth every few minutes like he was checking a patient's pulse. Around the third hour, one of the eggs cracked. The crack was small at first, a thin dark line running across the shell like a hair caught in the light. Daniel leaned closer, not quite believing it, and watched as a second line joined the first, then a third, until the shell looked like a cracked window about to give way. He did not know what to do. There was no manual in his head for this. No training course back on Earth had ever covered what to do when an alien egg starts hatching on your bedroom floor in the middle of a storm. He thought, briefly and stupidly, of boiling water, the way old stories talked about helping human Barbies into the world, and almost laughed at himself for it. Instead, he did the only thing that felt right. He picked the egg up carefully, cupping it in both hands, and held it against his chest, right over his heart, the way he might hold something cold that needed warming. The shell was rough against his palms, warmer now than before, almost hot in places. The crack spread further. A piece of shell fell away, no bigger than a fingernail, and through the gap he saw something dark and wet moving. He kept still. He barely breathed. Whatever pride he might have taken in staying calm during hull breaches or reactor scares was nothing compared to how hard it was to sit still while something ancient and unknown fought its way out of a shell against his chest. It took almost 20 minutes for the first hatchling to fully emerge. When it did, it was smaller than he expected, no bigger than a house cat, with damp grey-green scales that caught the low light of his room and a long, thin tail that immediately wrapped itself, without any hesitation at all, around his wrist. Daniel stared down at it. It stared back up at him with eyes like small orange coals, blinking slowly, and then, with a soft churring sound low in its throat, it climbed the rest of the way up his arm and pressed itself against his neck. He sat frozen for a long moment, unsure whether to be afraid. It did not feel threatening. It felt warm and small and impossibly fragile, and it was already breathing in slow rhythm with the rise and fall of his own chest, as though it had decided, the very moment it opened its eyes, that this was where it belonged. The second egg cracked before he had even fully processed the first hatching. He set the newly hatched creature gently on the bunk beside him, though it immediately climbed straight back onto his shoulder and picked up the second egg. This one hatched faster, almost eager, and the hatchling that emerged was slightly smaller, its scales a touch darker, more black than grey. It did not hesitate either. It crawled straight up his sleeve and tucked itself against his collarbone, small enough to fit almost entirely in the curve of his neck. By the time the third egg hatched, Daniel had stopped trying to reason his way through what was happening and had simply accepted that he now had two small alien creatures attached to him and a third on the way. The last hatchling was the smallest of the three, thinner, its movements shakier, as if it had used the last of its strength, simply breaking free of the shell. It did not climb up right away. It lay curled in his palm, trembling faintly, until he lifted it gently to rest against his chest with the others, and only then did its shivering slowly ease. He sat there until the grey light of the outpost's morning cycle began to filter through the narrow window slit near the ceiling. Three small creatures curled against him, breathing slow and steady, asleep, or something close to it. He had not moved in hours. His arm had gone numb somewhere around the second hatching, and he had not noticed until just now. When he finally tried to stand, planning to carry them to Dr. Mann's lab the moment it opened, he discovered the first real problem. The moment he shifted his weight, the largest of the three let out a sharp, distressed sound and tightened its tail around his wrist hard enough to leave a mark. The other two stirred immediately, pressing closer, small claws catching gently in the fabric of his shirt. He tried again, more carefully this time, standing slowly, expecting them to simply climb along with him the way they had all night. Instead, all three grew agitated the instant there was any real distance between his body and theirs, churring and hissing in a way that sounded less like curiosity and more like fear. It took him almost an hour of careful, patient effort to understand what was happening. They were not simply attached to him out of instinct or convenience. Somewhere in that long, quiet night, in every hour he had spent holding them against his heart while they broke free of their shells, something had happened that could not be undone with a change of room or a change of hands. They had decided, in whatever way small ancient creatures decide such things, that he was theirs and that they were his, and no amount of walking to another room was going to change that fact now. He looked down at the three small heads tucked against his chest, orange eyes drifting shut again in the pale morning light, and understood, with a slow and sinking feeling, that whatever came next was not going to be simple at all. Dr. Seligman's lab smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee substitute, and when Daniel walked in with three small creatures wrapped in a blanket against his chest, she nearly dropped the sample tray she was holding. She was Velkari, tall and thin the way most of her people were, with pale blue skin and eyes that missed very little. She set the tray down carefully, as though sudden movements might upset whatever she was looking at, and crossed the room slowly. "Where," she said, "did you get Vanthari hatchlings?" Daniel had not known what species they were until that moment. He told her about the crash, the crate, the storm, the eggs already cracked and warm when he found them. He left out the part where he had made a decision, alone, in the middle of the night, to bring hazardous unidentified biological cargo into his own quarters instead of reporting it. She figured that part out on her own anyway, from the way he would not quite meet her eyes. She did not scold him, not at first. She was too busy staring at the three hatchlings who had woken enough to peer out from the blanket at her with obvious suspicion, tails tightening further around Daniel's arm. "This should not be possible," she said quietly. "The Vanthari have been extinct as an active bonded species for generations. What remains are legends, war records, nothing living." "They seem pretty alive to me," Daniel said. Marn reached out slowly toward the smallest of the three. It hissed, a small sharp sound, and pressed itself harder against Daniel's chest. She pulled her hand back immediately, more startled than hurt. "They will not let me near them," she said. "They didn't let me put them down either," Daniel admitted. "Tried for an hour this morning, they don't like it." It took her only a short examination, careful and mostly visual since the hatchlings would not tolerate direct handling, to confirm what she already suspected. The three creatures had imprinted. Not simple recognition, not the kind of bonding some animals showed toward whoever fed them first. This was something older and far more permanent, written into the biology of a species that ancient records said had once been used, generations ago, as living weapons bonded to a single handler for life. "If the bond is broken," she explained carefully, watching Daniel's face as she said it, "the hatchlings will not survive it, not at this age. Their bodies are built around the connection from the moment they hatch." Daniel looked down at the three small heads, now watching Marn with wary orange eyes. "So what happens now?" That question, unfortunately, was not his to answer. It belonged to Councillor Thren, who arrived within the hour, alerted by Marn's own emergency report, and who stood in the doorway of the lab with an expression that made it very clear she considered this entire situation a disaster of the highest order. Thren was older than Marn, her pale skin creased with age lines around sharp, unfriendly eyes. She did not bother with pleasantries. "You brought unidentified hazardous biological cargo into a civilian sleeping quarter," she said to Daniel, each word clipped and cold. "Cargo that has since produced 3 live Vanthari, a species this council has classified as extinct, and prior to that classification, extremely dangerous." "They're the size of house cats," Daniel said. "Now," Thren said, "they will not stay that size." She turned to Marn, demanding a full report, and Marn gave one, careful and precise, though Daniel noticed she left out none of the details, including the part about the bond being unbreakable without killing the hatchlings. Thren's expression did not soften hearing it. If anything, it hardened further. "Then we have a problem," Thren said, "because Council protocol on any confirmed Vanthari bond, historical or otherwise, is immediate containment and evaluation for termination. Given the species' documented history as weaponized assets, in the war records. The word termination hung in the room for a long moment. Daniel felt the hatchlings shift against his chest, as though they understood, in whatever way small newly hatched creatures could understand anything, that the tone in the room had changed. "No," he said. Thren looked at him the way one might look at a maintenance drone that had suddenly started talking back. "This is not your decision, Mr. Ward." "They're attached to me," Daniel said. "You just heard the doctor say breaking that kills them. I'm not handing over 3 newly hatched animals so someone can run tests on them and then decide they're too dangerous to keep alive. They haven't done anything. They're a day old. They are a species with a documented history of mass casualties," Thren snapped. "That was a long time ago, and it wasn't them," Daniel said. "It was whoever bonded with them and made them do it." The room went quiet. Marn, watching from the side, said nothing, though something in her expression suggested she agreed more with Daniel than she was willing to say aloud in front of Thren. Thren's jaw tightened. "I do not have authority to override standing protocol on my own judgment, Mr. Ward, however sympathetic your position may sound. This will go to council review, and a fleet officer will be dispatched to assess the situation directly. Until then, you are confined to quarters, and the hatchlings will remain under observation." "They stay with me," Daniel said, "or none of us go anywhere." Thren stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether it was worth the fight right now. In the end, she turned and left without answering, which Daniel took cautiously as a kind of victory, though the tightness in his chest told him it was only the first round of something much larger. By the 4th day, Daniel had given all 3 hatchlings names, mostly because he had gotten tired of calling them the big one, the dark one, and the little one every time he needed to tell them apart. The largest, and clearly the boldest, he called Rook, because it reminded him of the heavy stone pieces in the old chess set his grandfather used to keep, solid and stubborn, and always the first to move toward trouble instead of away from it. The middle one, dark-scaled and endlessly curious, he called Cole, mostly because it had already gotten into the wiring panel under his desk twice and left a faint smudge of soot on its nose both times. The smallest, still the shyest of the 3, he called Wisp, because it moved like smoke, quiet and quick, always slipping just out of reach whenever anyone but Daniel tried to get close. Confined to quarters as he was, Daniel found the days strange but not entirely unpleasant. He had never had much of anything depending on him before, not really, not in a way that mattered every hour of every day. Now he had 3 small creatures who needed feeding, who needed watching, who apparently needed him within arm's reach at almost all times, or they grew agitated enough that Marn worried about their stress levels affecting their health. Marn visited daily, officially to monitor the hatchlings, unofficially, Daniel suspected, because she found the entire situation more fascinating than anything she had studied in years. She brought food supplements formulated from old Vanthari records, protein-rich paste that Rook devoured immediately, that Cole treated with suspicion until Wisp tried it first, and that Wisp herself only ate when Daniel fed her by hand, one small bite at a time. "They should not be this calm," Marn said one afternoon, watching Cole attempt, and fail, to climb the leg of Daniel's desk chair. "The old records describe Vanthari hatchlings as aggressive, difficult to manage, prone to lashing out at anyone, including their own handler." "They've never lashed out at me," Daniel said. "No," Marn agreed slowly. "That is what I find interesting." She spent that visit, and several after it, quietly observing the way the 3 hatchlings responded to Daniel specifically. Rook, who growled at loud voices and grew tense whenever Marn's own tone sharpened even slightly, relaxed instantly the moment Daniel spoke, low and even, regardless of what he was actually saying. Wisp, who hid from nearly everyone, always found her way back to Daniel's shoulder within minutes, no matter how far she wandered exploring the room. Cole, the most mischievous of the 3, tested boundaries constantly, but always seemed to check Daniel's reaction before pushing too far, as though his opinion mattered more than the mischief itself. "It is the bond," Marn said eventually, more to herself than to him, "but it is something about the bond specifically with you, steady, patient. I wonder if that shapes them as much as their own nature does." Daniel did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and went back to watching Cole finally succeed in climbing the chair leg, only to immediately fall off it again with an indignant squeak. The confinement had one small security scare during those days, though nothing came of it beyond a moment of tension. A minor malfunction in the outpost's east wing triggered an automatic lockdown alert, sirens briefly wailing through the corridors before engineering confirmed it was a false alarm caused by a faulty sensor. For those 30 seconds, though, all three hatchlings reacted immediately and violently, Rook rearing up with a low growl aimed at the door, Cole freezing mid-motion, Wisp burying herself so deep into Daniel's jacket he could barely see her at all. It took several minutes after the alarm stopped for Rook especially to calm down, and Daniel found himself sitting on the floor with all three curled tightly against him, speaking low and steady, the same tone he used when they were startled by anything, until slowly, one by one, their tense muscles eased and their breathing slowed back to normal. Thren, who had come to check on the confinement in person that same day, arrived just as the last of the tension was fading, and stood in the doorway watching the scene for longer than Daniel expected before saying anything at all. "That is not the behavior of a weapon reacting to a threat," she said eventually, her voice quieter than he had heard it before. "That is the behavior of frightened young reacting to danger they cannot understand." "They're a day-old, counselor," Daniel said, "give or take." Thren did not answer right away. She looked at the three hatchlings a moment longer, Rook now slowly relaxing back into a curl against Daniel's side, Cole peeking cautiously out from under his arm, Wisp still buried and refusing to reappear at all. "I have read the old war records extensively," Thren said finally. "None of them describe anything like this. None of them describe hatchlings calm enough to be soothed by a voice rather than restrained by force. Maybe the records only wrote down what happened after someone made them into weapons," Daniel said, "not what they were before that." Thren's expression did not change much, but something behind her eyes did, a small crack in the certainty she had carried into the room days earlier. She left without another word, but Daniel noticed, for the first time since the eggs had hatched, that she had not repeated her warning about the incoming fleet officer, or the review, or the word termination that had hung so heavily in Marn's lab that first day. It was not much, but it was something, and in the days since the crash, Daniel had learned to hold on to whatever small things he could get. The shuttle carrying Commander Eeth landed on the 7th day, and Daniel knew before anyone told him that things were about to get harder, simply from the way the outpost seemed to hold its breath as it touched down. Eeth was Velkari as well, though built differently from Thren or Marn, broader through the shoulders, moving with the kind of controlled precision that came from years spent in fleet command rather than administration or research. She wore the dark uniform of the regional authority, and behind her came 4 armed escorts, not a large force, but more than Corval's Edge had seen in years. Thren met them at the landing bay, and Daniel, watching from the observation window with all 3 hatchlings pressed close against him, felt his stomach tighten as the group began walking directly toward his quarters without stopping anywhere else first. Marn found him moments before they arrived, slightly out of breath, having clearly run most of the way from her lab. "I sent the commander my full observational data," she said quickly. "Behavioral patterns, stress responses, everything from the past week. I do not know if it will matter, but she should at least have it before she decides anything." "Will it matter?" Daniel asked. Marn hesitated. "I hope so." Eeth entered without knocking, Thren a half-step behind her, the 4 escorts remaining just outside the doorway. Her eyes went first to Daniel, then to the 3 hatchlings curled against him, expression unreadable in a way that Thren's rarely was. "Mr. Ward," she said, "I have read the doctor's reports. I have also read the historical records on the Vanthari, records that describe entire fleets lost to bonded creatures exactly like these, under handlers who believed, right up until the moment it happened, that their bond was different, safer, more controlled than anyone else's." "I'm not a fleet handler," Daniel said. "I'm a maintenance engineer." "That does not change the biology," Eeth said. My orders, given the confirmed presence of a live, stable Vanthari bond, are to euthanize the hatchlings before the bond matures further and the risk becomes unmanageable. I am here to carry out those orders." The words landed heavy in the small room. Rook, sensing the tension in Daniel's body before anything else happened, let out a low growl, rising slightly, tail flicking sharply against Daniel's arm. It was not a large gesture. Rook was still barely the size of a large cat, but it was enough to make one of the escorts in the doorway shift his weapon slightly, and enough to make Edith's eyes narrow. "There," she said quietly, "that reaction, right there, is exactly the beginning of what the old records describe. Aggression triggered by perceived threat to the handler. It only grows from here." Daniel felt his pulse spike, understanding immediately how badly this moment could go, how easily Rook's protective instinct could be read as exactly the confirmation Edith needed to justify what she had come here to do. He did not shout. He did not grab for Rook or try to physically restrain him, knowing that would only make things worse. Instead, he lowered his voice, the same steady, even tone he had used during the false alarm days earlier, and rested one hand gently along Rook's back. "Easy," he said quietly. "Easy, nobody's hurting anyone. Easy now." Rook's growl did not stop immediately, but it softened, the tension in his small body slowly easing under Daniel's hand, tail loosening its grip, until within a minute he had settled back down, still watchful, still alert, but no longer poised to strike. Cole, who had frozen at the first sign of tension, slowly relaxed as well, and Wisp, who had vanished entirely into Daniel's jacket the moment the escorts entered, cautiously peeked back out. The room was quiet for a long moment. Edith watched the entire exchange without moving, her expression harder to read now than it had been a minute ago. "That," Maan said carefully, breaking the silence, "is not what the old records describe either, Commander. Every historical account of Vanthari aggression ends in escalation, not de-escalation. What you just witnessed was a stressed, frightened young creature calmed entirely through voice and presence, with no restraint, no force, no suppression of any kind. That is not the behavior of a weapon. That is the behavior of an animal that trusts its handler completely." Edith did not answer right away. She looked at Rook, now curled quietly against Daniel's side again, then at Cole, cautiously sniffing at the edge of her boot from a safe distance, then at Wisp. Still mostly hidden, but no longer trembling. "The historical accounts," she said slowly, "were all written about bonds formed under military conditions, by handlers selected and trained specifically to command, not to protect. I had not considered what a bond formed under entirely different circumstances might look like." "Because nobody's ever seen one," Thren said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "I did not believe it either, Commander. I have spent the past week watching it happen anyway." Edith was quiet for a long moment, weighing something behind her sharp eyes. "My orders are not something I can simply set aside on the strength of one calm moment," she said finally, "but I am not willing to execute 3 hatchlings based on records that may no longer apply to what is standing in front of me. I will hold the order pending a full review. You have until that review concludes, Mr. Ward, to make whatever case you intend to make." It was not a victory. Daniel understood that clearly, standing there with Rook's steady weight against his side, and Cole still cautiously exploring Edith's boot, and Wisp's small head finally emerging fully from his jacket. But it was a door left open, however narrow, and after everything the past week had cost him, he intended to walk through it. The review took place 2 days later in the outpost's largest meeting room, a space usually reserved for trade negotiations. Its long table now cleared for what Daniel understood, without anyone saying it directly, might be the closest thing to a trial the 3 hatchlings would ever get. Commander Edith sat at the head of the table, Thren beside her, along with 2 other council officials Daniel had barely spoken to in his 3 years on the outpost. Dr. Maan sat across from them, a stack of data files in front of her. Daniel sat at the far end, Rook curled in his lap, Cole perched on his shoulder, Wisp tucked against his chest, where she had spent most of the past 2 days, still the most cautious of the 3 even now. Maan spoke first, presenting her full observational data, without exaggeration or apology, describing in careful clinical detail the calm behavioral patterns, the stress responses that eased rather than escalated, The complete absence of any aggression toward anyone other than brief protective flares, triggered only by direct threat to Daniel himself, which she noted was a far cry from the unprovoked hostility described in every historical Vanthari account on record. The variable, she said, closing her final file, is not the species. It is the bond itself. Every prior record involves handlers trained to command through dominance. This bond formed through an entirely different foundation, patience, protection, and calm presence, with no attempt at all to control or direct the hatchling's behavior. I believe that foundation is why the outcome looks nothing like history predicted. Thren spoke next, and Daniel had not expected what she said. I came into this review prepared to support termination, she said plainly. I have spent the past week and a half looking for evidence that would justify that position. I did not find it. What I found instead was 3 hatchlings calmer and more stable than any historical account describes, and one man who gave up his own sleep, his own comfort, and very nearly his position on this outpost, simply because he could not bring himself to let 3 unhatched creatures freeze to death alone in a wrecked shuttle. I do not know what that says about the Vanthari, but I know what it says about him. The room was quiet for a moment. Daniel felt his face go warm, unused to being spoken about like that, especially by someone who had threatened to have him removed from the outpost only days earlier. Eth turned to him last. You have heard the data, Mr. Ward. You have heard the testimony. Is there anything you wish to add before this review concludes? Daniel had thought about what he might say for 2 days straight, rehearsing arguments about biology and precedent and risk assessment, trying to sound like someone who belonged in a room like this. In the end, none of that felt true when the moment actually arrived. I'm not a scientist, he said. I don't know the history the way Dr. Mann does, and I don't know council protocol the way you or Councillor Thren do. I just know I found 3 eggs in a wrecked shuttle, cold, alone, and still alive, and I couldn't leave them there. That's it. That's the whole reason any of this happened. Not because I wanted a bond, or knew what a Vanthari even was, or thought I was doing something important. I just didn't want something small to die alone in the dark if I could stop it. He looked down at Rook, still curled quietly in his lap, then at Cole on his shoulder, then at Wisp, finally lifting her head enough to look around the room with open orange eyes instead of hiding. That's not a weapons decision, he said. That's just what you do when something needs help, and you're the only one standing there. I don't know if that's a human thing or just a person thing, but it's the only reason we're all sitting here, and I don't think it should be the reason they get executed. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Eth looked at the 3 hatchlings, then at Daniel, then down at the data files still spread across the table in front of Marn. I came here to carry out a termination order, Eth said finally, based on records of a war fought long before any of us were born, against handlers who no longer exist, using methods no one in this room has any part of. I find I cannot, in good conscience, apply those records to what I have witnessed here. This bond will not be terminated. Effective immediately, I am reclassifying this bond as a first contact behavioral anomaly, subject to ongoing observation rather than containment protocol. Relief hit Daniel harder than he expected, enough that he had to steady himself with one hand flat against the table. Rook, sensing the shift in him immediately, pressed closer against his side, while Cole let out a small chirping sound that might have been triumph, and Wisp finally, for the first time since the review began, climbed fully out into the open and settled calmly across Daniel's forearm. You understand, Eth added, that this makes you their sole guardian under galactic observation indefinitely. That is not a small responsibility, Mr. Ward. I know, Daniel said, looking down at the 3 of them. I think I knew that the night I brought them in out of the storm. Word of what happened on Corval's Edge spread slowly at first, through supply routes and trade reports, then faster, the way unusual stories always did across a galaxy hungry for something worth talking about. A human engineer, no rank, no authority, no scientific training, had refused to let 3 ancient, feared creatures die, and in doing so had shown an entire outpost, and eventually far more than that, something about humanity that few outside species had ever bothered to consider before. Daniel never thought of it in those terms. To him, it stayed simple, the same as it had been that first cold night in the storm. He walked the corridors of Corval's Edge each morning with Rook at his heel, Cole on his shoulder, and Wisp curled quietly against his chest, three small dragons who had wrapped themselves around his heart before anyone, including Daniel himself, had a chance to stop them, and who, as far as he was concerned, were never going anywhere at all.